Bittman for Edible Education 101, and I'm here with Anna Lappe, who is an author and founder of Real Food Media, and Sabrina Adler, who is a lawyer and senior staff attorney at ChangeLab Solutions. Hi there, thanks for coming.
Hi Mark, thank you for having us.
I really have like this one, I say this all the time. I say there are 4 or 5 really big issues in food, and the one that breaks my heart the most, the one that really kills me, the one that keeps me up at night is the marketing of junk to children. We could talk about the others, and they're bad, and there's a lot of egregious stuff going on in food, I'm sure we all agree. But this one to me is the one that sets everything back, that means that the future is 25 years away, that no one's going to be healthy for a long time, and that is just the most onerous, horrible thing. Well, blah, blah, blah. So, what do you say?
Yeah.
I mean, how is this relevant to your work, and what can we do about this, and am I wrong, or what? And so, why don't you start
well,
on
I
that?
mean, I have heard you say that before, and I couldn't agree with you more. And I think one of the things that's so important, I think, about raising it as such a critical issue is because a lot of people dismiss it as, what are you talking about marketing to kids? Isn't it parents who are ultimately the deciders? And isn't this about just turning off your television? And really dismissing it as a marginal, not really a critical issue the way, say, food and climate change or labor rights in the food chain would be. But what people don't understand is, and I mean, people maybe save for us, and there are increasingly the people who do get it, that it is a critical issue because, as you said, it really sets up a lifelong pattern of eating habits. It sets up a barrier between parents and their children. It sets up dietary patterns that have this incredible impact on the health of a whole generation. And we know that the industry isn't pulling back on that marketing to kids. It's doubling down on it at the tune of more than $2 billion a year in targeted marketing and advertising to children and teens, when we know, and the science has proven, that children are literally unable to understand, cognitively get it, the difference between information and marketing. In other words, children are totally vulnerable to marketing and advertising in a way that we adults aren't. And so it's wrong on moral grounds, it's wrong on health grounds, and as you say, it really sets up generations of people to have these really terrible eating habits.
Well, yeah, we can get into that. I always say, I know how irrational adults are, and children are even dumber, so yeah.
Right, I mean, isn't it our frontal lobes aren't developed until we're 20, I think, so.
Yeah. I just heard 25.
25, all right.
The other day.
In my case, it was 35. Is there something you want to say before I ask you specific questions?
Yeah, so the other thing that I would add to that, too, is that it's just so ubiquitous, and it appears in so many forms that people, maybe when they initially think about marketing, think about things like billboards or the ads on TV, but it's not just that. It's contests, it's social media, it's product placement in TV shows and movies, it's coming into schools. So beyond just, I think, the very obvious things that people think of when they think about advertising, this marketing is much broader than that and really is infiltrating kids' lives in everywhere they go and in every form.
I think, for the sake of, and we have a limited time here, for the sake of this conversation, maybe we spend a few minutes on the problem, but then maybe a little more time even on what possible solutions. Sabrina, I interviewed Samantha Graff, I don't know if you know her,
she's
colleague.
my predecessor, colleague, both.
I don't know, probably 5 years ago when I first started really being unhappy about this, I guess, or really trying to. And I guess I didn't know that, as you said, this is morally wrong, this is wrong from a health perspective, this is wrong, et cetera, but it's not illegal. And there's a First Amendment issue here, and it's a real stumbling block. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So I'll draw a distinction to begin with, which is that it can be made illegal and it is not protected by the First Amendment to the extent that it is deceptive or misleading. And we can go down that road a little bit more if you'd like to, but there is an argument to be made that all marketing to very young kids, for the reason that Anna mentioned, because of their lack of cognitive development, is therefore not protected. But there are a lot of practical problems with approaching it that way, not the least of which is it's hard to figure out how to craft a law that really isolates that type of marketing, and that's an argument that hasn't been tested in court at all. So we don't know that a court would agree with that theory. It's something we talk about a lot, but the reality, and what you're alluding to, is that there is this thing called the First Amendment that, for better or for worse, is protective of what the courts call commercial speech, which is essentially advertising. And that does make it very difficult to enact regulations that directly address marketing. There's one other distinction I'll draw, and again, we can pursue this path further, but just to set it out there, which is it does, however, really refer or protect the marketing that is speech-based. So what I just spoke about, the degree of marketing that takes so many different forms, there is, I think, a lot more leeway for us to do something about those other forms of marketing that aren't billboard ads or something on TV or things that directly
Because they're
implicate
not literally speech?
Correct.
Yeah, and just to jump in, this sort of gets into some of the solutions piece as well as a bit of the problem piece, is that, as Sabrina said, this marketing, it touches kids in every step of their lives and every point of their day. And one of the places that we're really concerned about where it's impacting kids is in schools. So you're starting to see branded curriculum in schools. I was just looking at preschool and elementary level math curriculum produced by Kellogg's with Fruit Loops counting cups and M&M counting charts. I mean, in schools, you have branded curriculum.
Forgive me for interrupting. I cannot believe
Yes.
that that's
yes.
legal.
Oh, yeah.
No, yes. But what I was going to say, and I could go on. I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we're seeing in schools. There's many other examples. Like a colleague of mine from Louisiana reached out to me to tell me that her kid came home from school and said, "Oh, Mom, guess what? We had an assembly today with a guy named Ronald McDonald." And she said, "What are you talking about?" Turns out Ronald McDonald and McDonald's sends their character into schools to do community assemblies, teaching about things like reading and how to be a good community citizen, with a guy dressed up like a branded icon from this fast food chain. And this mom said, I didn't send my daughter to school so she could get advertised to during the all-school assembly.
Taught by Ronald McDonald.
Right.
Yeah.
But to bring this back to the solutions piece, I mean, there are, of course, ways that schools are totally legally allowed to they're allowed to decide what is and is not permissible inside schools and in those public places. And so, for instance, wellness policies, which were developed really from communities really interested in improving the quality of food in schools. But wellness policies, increasingly, many of them in school districts across the country include clauses about what is permissible in terms of marketing and advertising in schools. And some school districts say, with these wellness policies, that we don't want to see branded curriculum. We don't allow branded signage in the school gymnasium. We don't allow branded vending machines. So something like the wellness policy can be used in that particular way to limit marketing to kids in schools.
This leaves addressing the problem in the hand of individual schools or school districts. What can be done about the big picture? I mean, we have the obvious question is we have the tobacco model to follow, which there's still some loopholes, but for the most part, you don't see billboards with Joe Camel on them anymore. You can't market stuff to kids. There's no television advertising. One could argue, and people do, that sugar, junk food, etc., is not physically addictive in the same way that tobacco is. They correctly argue that, but there is increasing evidence that it's at least somewhat addictive, and certainly it's harmful. There's tons of evidence that it's harmful. So we are, destroying the lives of future generations of people. How can we not be preventing, so how can we prevent this? What can we do?
So two things in response to what you've just said. First, the tobacco model that gets used a lot as a kind of example of getting rid of advertising and marketing to kids. A lot of that, for better or for worse, came from the settlement agreement that followed the lawsuit that the attorneys general filed against the big tobacco companies. So they've voluntarily agreed, voluntary, maybe we use that word in quotation marks, but they agreed as part of that settlement process not to market in certain ways, including ways that would not necessarily be okay if they had been enacted through direct regulation. But turning back to the schools issue and what can we actually do so it's not left up to the individual school level, a little glimmer of hope perhaps is that there is a forthcoming, and it's been imminent for many months now, but I truly believe it is imminent at this point, federal rule that will require all school districts around the country to at least address unhealthy food marketing in their wellness policies. Now, the details of that will be left up to the district level, but at the very least, it's setting a baseline. But it also is that is a policy area, and because schools, what I just mentioned earlier about it being very difficult legally to address food marketing, Anna touched on this, but because it's a school environment and it's a public property and the government is controlling speech on its own grounds, there's a lot more leeway to do something. And even, for example, state level laws that set a limit on food marketing in schools, whether that's a limit on unhealthy food marketing or just a limit on food marketing in general or marketing in general, are actually would be, for the most part, okay.
Where's that federal regulation coming from?
The federal regulation it's coming from a set of regulations that were developed in response to the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. And it's a general rule about wellness policies around the country and what they have to contain. And one small but important piece of it has to do with limiting food marketing.
And it's under the Healthy Hunger
It is
Free
regulations
Kids Act?
that were enacted or promulgated, I should say, in response to a mandate by that is part of the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. Yeah.
Anna?
Yeah, well, so not to bring us all down, but I think one of the areas that, while I think, as you say, this is a glimmer of hope, we're seeing some progress there, where I feel like we're really losing the bigger battle is what's happening in the online space. So what you hear from the industry is we're self-regulating, we're reducing how much we're spending on television advertising, we're reducing our big ad spends, and they can say that because they are shifting the dollars. A lot of these food companies are shifting a lot of their marketing dollars to this online engagement with kids, and what many advocates, not just sort of from the food space, but advocates for protecting children in general from marketing of all sorts, are saying is that right now what's happening online is like the Wild West. That there's very little regulation, very little oversight, and so you can find things, and I went down this rabbit hole, it was quite disturbing. You can find websites that are targeting young kids, things like, just to give one example, Kraft Macaroni and Cheese has this website where you can play this game with the macaroni and make macaroni art, and it's totally targeting kids. And it asks you to put in your birthday, it asks you to put in identifying information, it even asks in some cases, not that website in particular, but some of them even ask for your phone number that you can get free prizes. And in this one particular Kraft Macaroni and Cheese website totally targeting children, there's a tiny little, I think it was like 7-point font, little note that said, read this for our rules, and you click on it, and it's thousands of words of legalese that I could barely understand, and 3/4 of the way through it says, and children, if you're reading this, be sure to ask your parents before you engage on this website. I mean, it's ridiculous on the face of it.
One of the amazing things about that is that a lot of it is geared to 4-year-olds.
Oh yeah.
They're not even reading, or they're barely reading. So McDonald's flagship website. It's their Happy Meals website that has these definitely targeting preschoolers, and so that is where the regulation has not kept up with how fast the young people's online engagement is happening, and that's where advocacy groups have tried to step in. Groups like Corporate Accountability International or the Campaign for Commercial-Free Childhood have tried to step in with the fiery activists to try to make a change there, because the regulation is just not keeping up. What about courts and lawsuits and things banding together of attorneys generals a la tobacco? There must be activity in all of those arenas.
Yeah, I think there's chatter, but it's a really tough one for the reasons that I just described. Yeah, exactly. again, we can go back to the fact that things that are deceptive are not protected, and I think we could start to see some action in that area. I think it's feasible to file complaints, for example, but a complaint-driven process, unfortunately, is not going to have the same wide impact as coming at it from a more global perspective. I think a lot of these things that you see online, for example, probably are, in theory at least, violating certain laws already about deceptive advertising. The laws exist, but enforcement in the online arena, and I'm far from an expert on digital law, the law that has to do with the digital space, it's very complicated, but there's so much that you don't see and you don't know what's happening until you happen to navigate down the kind of rabbit hole of Facebook or whatever it might be to come across it. And you could file a complaint, but then you'd have to do that over and over and over again.
I'm looking for something a little more optimistic from you, or hopeful.
Yeah.
Well, and I think one of the things that I find hopeful, and I think it's because we have these challenges at that national level. What I find hopeful are the stories that I'm hearing all across the country of successes at that local level. So, for instance, a couple years ago, some Florida parents saw that their district had signed a deal with McDonald's to have an advertisement from McDonald's on the back of the report cards that were going to be sent home to parents. And it wasn't that many parents who saw that this was happening who reached out to the Campaign for Commercial-Free Childhood, a national advocacy organization. And with the help of that organization, they were able to go to the district and say, this is unconscionable, you've got to stop it. And they got that stopped. I mean, is that a positive story? Is it a hopeful one or not? But I do think it does speak to when people organize collectively in response to these moments of some of the most egregious moments, you are seeing some change. Another really encouraging example of that is another way that kids are marketed to in schools is with a practice called McTeachers Nights. So this is a fundraiser that McDonald's pitches to schools where their franchisees open up their franchise for an evening, and the teachers and the principal often go to a local McDonald's and serve food all night, encouraging the school community to come have a meal at McDonald's and have their meals served by these teachers. Turns out that per kid, it ends up being maybe $1 per kid what the school actually gets back from profit of the evening. And obviously, it's a total advertisement for McDonald's. So one of the groups I mentioned, Corporate Accountability International, they just organized a group of school board members at the National School Board Association to call on school board members to call on those members to say, hey, let's stop this practice in the school districts that you represent. And they were starting to get some traction there. So, I think it's one of these stories of we need to mobilize and activate at all these levels. So the work you're doing is so critical on the legal front, at the same time trying to spark and energize people at the local level to feel like they can make change in their own communities while we're also working on that level, I think is really important.
Last question, I think, is, we've been talking specifically about marketing kids' food-ish to kids, but of course there's marketing of junk food to everyone that affects kids as well. And I think we'd probably agree that the number one evil in this arena is sugar-sweetened beverages. There has been a tiny bit of progress in limiting the marketing of that, most notably the soda tax in Berkeley, but internationally much, much more, the junk and soda food tax in Mexico and other countries. And here, both Oakland and San Francisco are looking at soda taxes again this year, and people are much more optimistic, hopeful than they have been. Is that a road that we want to support? Obviously I want to support it, but is it something that we think is a good strategy? Is it something that's going to work going forward? Are there better strategies people are looking at?
I think it's a number of strategies used in tandem. If nothing else, I think the soda tax or sugary drink tax movements and efforts are changing the conversation. And even when they're not passing, they're spreading the word about these products. People are paying attention more than they were. I just saw today, I think, that bottled water sales are eclipsing soda sales, which we can argue whether bottled water is a good thing or not, but soda sales are declining. I think used in conjunction with other strategies, for example, putting warning labels either on sugary drink containers or on the advertisements themselves, as San Francisco has just proposed, is another piece of changing the conversation. And these are all things that we can do given the legal climate. So coming at it from various different directions, I think in certain places it's not politically feasible to think about a tax, so you maybe think about a different strategy. And when you put them all together, at the very least, I think it is changing the conversation, which is the first step.
Yeah, and I think already the win here in Berkeley with the soda tax already is changing the conversation when I hear from people in other parts of the country about what they considered politically feasible before and what they consider now. And I think there's a real opening. I think the fact that we are showing here in Berkeley when the tax passed, the soda industry spent about $2.4 million trying to fight and stop the tax here. We're a city of 100,000 people. It ended up being something like $700 for every yes vote they got. But the fact that they lost badly here and that they really did it really did show that once implemented, so it's only been a year or so since the tax passed, but we already have the data to show it's about $1.2 million in revenue that's now going directly to diabetes prevention programs and nutrition programs and the kinds of things people are really hungry for funding for. So I'm starting to hear other communities say, wait a second, that passed there, and it actually, not only did it create this tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, but it's also bringing in revenue for the programs we need. Philadelphia is another city you didn't mention that's also looking into it. So I really feel like I don't feel like I am going out on a limb to say that we are going to look back and say this was just the beginning and we are going to see these taxes really sweep the country. I think we're going to see that in just the next few years. Yeah.
I'll say a little more, even though it's superfluous, but Philly, of course, almost passed the soda tax. It was a long time ago now, 5 or 6 years ago. New York almost passed the soda tax.
Yeah, do you remember what the soda industry did in Philly? So it was the mayor that put it forward, and the city council. What's that?
Mike Nutter.
Right, that's right. Yeah, exactly. And the city council was pretty well in support of it, and the soda industry came in, and I'm not going to remember the exact dollar figure, but north of $10 million they gave a grant to the local children's hospital, and it just tipped the scales, and the city council balked. And again, I do feel like there is this changing tenor in the country around the influence of corporations in politics and that kind of buying our vote, that I think we're starting to see a lot more distaste for it. I think we are starting to see some attitudes changing around that, and I do feel like we'll see that with more people really feeling like they can have a backbone and stand up against big soda spending that kind of money. And my favorite, I'll say one more thing on the soda tax, my favorite quote I heard from that campaign here in Berkeley was a young door-knocking organizer who was talking to a libertarian about the soda tax. And this libertarian was, I want the soda tax. And this young organizer said, but wait a second, aren't you supposed to be against, big government? And don't you think those of us who are for something like this are the food police? And the guy said, well, if there's anything that I hate more than the government telling me what to do, it's corporations telling the government to tell me what to do.
Exactly.
So I think there's a real kind of broad coalition, a big tent that can get behind this kind of tax.
That's good. I think that we didn't talk much about this, but obviously the longer we delay teaching our kids sound nutrition, good dietetic advice, or what real food is, it just boils down to that, the more we're going to see one generation after another be ill 25, 50 years from now. And at some point people are just going to smack their heads and say, we could have fixed this a long time ago. Anyway, thank you both.
Thank you.
Really great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mark Bittman for Edible Education, and I've been speaking with Anna Lappe and Sabrina Adler.